At the same time, may I point out that there were no change of use planning applications granted for Cork City. Cork City has not granted any. So that is a clear indication where that individual has not applied for is not operating within the law and is pulling in €71,000 per year. And Cork City Council is not able, doesn't have the resourcing capacity to do the enforcement that the platform should be doing themselves.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 137 for the 23rd of June 2022. A bit like the last time, we really got into it in this interview, so I won't put in an editorial here either. There's enough of me and my thoughts already, but I promise I will do another scripted editorial soon. So I'll just say thanks to all of the patrons on Patreon. I really appreciate them all. We don't get a huge amount of money out of it, not nearly as much as some other Irish podcasters I could mention, but it pays for things like the web hosting, and Kevin and myself donate our time basically for free. It's also a great morale booster. When we get a new patron, we're really delighted. It lets us know that there are people out there who listen and appreciate the podcast. We make a big effort to cover things that are undercovered in the Irish media. Now, you're more than welcome to listen for free, but if you think that you could do the same as the other donors and throw in the price of a small chips from Supermax once or twice a month, there's details of how to do that on the website and at the end of the show. On the line, I have Ellie O'Byrne. She is one of the co-editors of Tripe and Drisheen. That's a Cork-based Substack, which she tells me isn't a blog, but it's a local news source. And Ellie, I was chatting with you about a post that you wrote about Airbnb in Cork. And rather than me making a mess of summarising it, why don't you summarise what you wrote?
Sure. Thanks very much for having me on, William. I wrote an investigative long form article. We normally do these on Thursdays. They're called our long reads and they're normally investigative in nature. They go out on Thursdays. And I wrote one about Airbnb a couple of weeks ago. So this is quite specific to Cork, which is where we're based. But I suppose you can extrapolate from that to the entire country. And it's certainly something we're seeing at the moment. So I just wanted to go looking. I was actually originally contacted by a woman who is herself a host who appears in the article, but she was very concerned about the professionalisation of what started off as a very nice idea, this platform, this Airbnb, that it was a lovely way to earn a little bit of extra money for a spare bedroom and all that type of thing. And so I took the lead from how Threshold, the tenants' rights organisation, approached how they looked at Airbnb. So I used a platform called AirDNA, which is actually something that's designed for people who want to invest in Airbnb. Mm-hmm. So it's designed for analytics. So it's a website that has analytical tools for pulling out what areas are profitable and that type of thing.
It scrapes the data from the Airbnb website and kind of represents the data that maybe Airbnb don't exactly want you to have.
Yeah, and also I think it's fair to say at this stage that they do Vrbo as well. So, like they're saying short-term letting platforms. So, but Airbnb is the giant of that. I think that Vrbo only has something like 3% of the market on that website. So it is primarily Airbnb. So what I did was I did a snapshot of one day and this was slightly out of season as well, because that was March 31st, which isn't exactly the summer peak when the most properties are up. But what I discovered, the thing that really struck me the most is that there were 1,089 entire homes listed on Airbnb for that date. So the entire total, so there were 1,548 properties advertised for Cork City and County, and of those 70%, 1,089 were entire homes. And the reason why that's important is that is really the competition for if you're looking at the rental market and the impacts on the rental market. Entire homes are properties that could be otherwise rented to long-term.
When you say competition, that's what's competing with the renters, not with the landlords.
I mean, no, that's what's putting the pressure on the housing market.
Yeah, exactly.
So the fact that all of these properties are going up on short-term letting sites instead of being advertised. So I took this snapshot, and on that day, so 1,089 entire homes in Cork City and County. Now, obviously, we have West Cork, so it's quite a tourism-heavy county, to be fair. So 1,089, and then I looked on daft.ie, and there were 62 long-term rental properties in all of Cork City and County on the same day. So I just think that that's, obviously very, very indicative of a lot. And I think that's the kind of
what does it
headline
indicate? What does it
figure.
indicate?
Well, I think it indicates a migration amongst landlords away from long-term letting to more profitable short-term lets.
Okay, I think you've put that very well. I note that also in Cork, Councillor Fiona Ryan of People Before Profit, I think on foot of your article, then tweeted out, taking the figures for the whole of Ireland, saying, but as others have also pointed out, we have 25,000 plus Airbnb vacancies, and ironically saying, what a functional housing market we have. Can I just ask you one thing? You may disagree with me on this, but I think it might not be mathematically exactly valid, the comparison you're making. That doesn't mean it's irrelevant, but if you were to, for example, compare the number of cars and the number of buses sold in the country every year, you might get a radically different number, but that doesn't give a very good indication of the different uses of different modes of transport. And by definition, short-term lets are being advertised pretty much all the time, whereas long-term lets are mostly not being advertised. So when you looked at the number of short-term lets, that's pretty much the entire market. The 63 or whatever it was, number of homes being advertised for long-term rental, that's of course only the tiniest fraction. So you're comparing the whole of the short-term let to just a small fraction of the long-term let. Am I right?
Well, that's a point that I've heard. Obviously it's clear that when a long-term rental property goes out and is actually let, then it wouldn't then be rented, it wouldn't be advertised, and it might not be rented for several years or whatever. Mm-hmm. I would dispute the notion that that Airbnb isn't working to some extent the same. A lot of people take their properties down for large chunks of the year, mm-hmm. partly to protect themselves against some of the more recent attempts to regulate. And there's a very high turnover of people who try it out for short periods of time and stuff like that. So I don't think that, that's only a snapshot of one day. It's seasonally extremely huge fluctuations there. Again, March 31st is pre-season, so, you would probably see that figure go up by now. So I don't think it's the case that every single property that is being used for short-term let is active, advertised on the platform at all times. Having said that, I take the point that there is a discrepancy there between how the two function in terms of what the function of something like that is and the function of something like. But at the same time, the point of doing this is to provide a snapshot of here are homes today. Here are 1,089 homes that are advertised on this platform. And here are 62 rental properties. And the other thing as well is that, those homes do stay up throughout successive letting. So you're seeing the home at a point at which one group of holidaymakers are in it and you're going to be renting it for the next week or whatever. But I still think that the important thing there is to provide a snapshot about the volume of homes that are in use by short-term letting platforms. By landlords, short-term letting.
Sure, and it's perhaps a small asterisk to put beside the data rather than saying that the data is invalid. One thing that I want to do, and you mentioned the Airbnb, AirDNA, I think it's called, website, which takes data from Airbnb. Another website that does that I found useful is Inside Airbnb. They're very much coming from the background of campaigning against Airbnb. You can see all of the text on their website is very clearly opposed to Airbnb, and they do the same thing. You can pull the data, and you're based in Cork. I'm going to get you, I will ban all jokes about the real capital, but I'm going to get you to look at Dublin. And I just want to know...
Where's that?
I just want to see that there's a couple of filters that you can put on that. And I know that you have it up on your screen as well, and I will put links to this in the show notes so the listeners can do this as well. And I can see today it says 6,921 listings in Dublin. And you mentioned, I think it was you're absolutely correct, that there's a difference between one bedroom in a house being let and the entire house being let. Because, and I've looked into this and I've looked into the types of this, and moving to Galway I saw, and I'm not going to give precise names here, but Patricia running a bed and breakfast, bona fide Irish Tourist Board approved bed and breakfast that has 9 bedrooms in it, and each of those 9 bedrooms is being advertised on Airbnb. That counts to the 25,000. So 9 of the 25,000 that Councillor Fiona Ryan was saying were, vacant properties. Those are 9 separate bedrooms in one bona fide bed and breakfast. I'm sure, well, I know because you wrote the article and said it, you don't accept that that's 9 separate properties that could be returned to the rental market, the long-term rental market.
No, to be clear, that's why the most important figure is the entire homes.
Yes, so, exactly.
So that's why I focused on that figure. So we're looking at the Dublin page there now, the entire home. This is interesting, and this is a trend that I think is probably kind of a difference between Dublin and Cork, is that the entire homes there is running at 49%.
Yeah,
in
exactly.
Most parts
it's
of County
half
Cork.
and half split. Half of the listings are entire homes, half of them are private rooms in a hotel, in a bed and breakfast, or whatever.
In most parts of County Cork, that would be 70% entire homes.
Yeah, it changes around the country. We'll have a look at the whole Ireland figures in a moment. But there is also another filter that you can put on this, which is activity. And one thing that I know, and I know because I'm aware of examples of this, that there are people who, when they go perhaps on holidays, or more likely when they have commitments outside their home area, or most likely outside the country, they have family commitments or work commitments outside the country, and they come and go and spend most of the year in Ireland, but not all of it. In the meantime, they put their home on Airbnb. There might be a tax issue with that, but when you filter only to show properties that are regularly booked on Airbnb, out of the 6,900 and odd in Dublin, there's just 430, and you can see from the map that those are hugely concentrated in the city centre. And what I'm wondering about is whether it would be valid to include all of those. And I think, and I hear what you say about people not including those properties to try and dodge being caught in the net, but I'm personally aware of more than one instance of this, and I think that properties that have the owner family living in it for most of the year, and then occasionally in the year it is let on Airbnb, that's not something that really has the capacity to be returned to long-term letting market. That's somebody who's looking to rent a house because they want to live in it. Those properties don't have the capacity to do that, do they?
No, of course not. And that's why the law that came into effect in July 2019, I think it's a very fair and balanced one, because what it does is it makes it mandatory for people to apply for a change of use planning retention if you're letting for more than 90 days each year. Yeah. So really what that law is trying to do is it's trying to drag the Airbnb activity back to really what the platform was founded for, which was precisely what you're describing there. I mean, I think, because I'm very much in favour of writing with balance and exploring different avenues. You'll see if you read that long form article that I wrote, that I interviewed this lady, Grace, who's in North Cork, who, she has a couple of small kids. Her and her husband are both working. They were lucky enough to be able to build on family land, and they built, as people often do in the countryside, a nice big house, and they have a spare bedroom, and she Airbnbs that bedroom at the weekends. I'm seeing a kind of a weird dog in the manger, nobody should be able to profit from anything thing out there at the moment in response to this story.
Pause on that. I'm going to get to that because I'm going to get you to pause on that because I'm going to come to that, and I want to look at the figures for Ireland as a whole. As I said, out of the nearly 7,000 properties listed in Dublin, only 430 of them are entire properties, not just a single bedroom, that are usually up on Airbnb. Those figures for Ireland are, as Councillor Fiona Ryan said, 25,000 listings, but of those 25,000 listings, only 6,000 are entire properties which are usually on Airbnb. That's to say they're not single bedrooms and they're not something that's only occasionally when the owners are away there. So there's a big difference between 6,000 and 25,000. But if you look at the map, you can see that those 6,000, and you can filter, the map filters very nicely. This is an excellent website, really. Those properties are concentrated in Dublin city centre, as I mentioned, not in the suburbs, like right in the city centre, and also in West Cork. You mentioned it's a big tourist county, in Kerry, lots on the north coast of Clare, big clump around Galway, big clump around Donegal. It strikes me that they're not, of course there are housing needs in those places, but it strikes me that those do seem to have more of a profile, and it's quite helpful because then Airbnb lists the top hosts. And there are some personal names there. So like Patricia, the woman running a bed and breakfast in Galway. But it's clear that some of those are personal names, and you'd wonder, was that someone who is running a business by just buying up houses and Airbnb-ing them, which is really the cliched thing that we hear, and we see a lot of it in the press and on Twitter and so forth. But I managed to get a couple of them on Google. Well, I only really managed to get one, and the host name is called Galway Bay Sea View, and that accounts for 10 entire homes that are usually on Airbnb. So I looked them up, found their website, found them on Google Maps, and it's blindingly obvious that this is a tourist development. It's self-catering tourist apartments. So I can't investigate all 6,000 of those listings, but I know that 10 of those 6,000 listings are a tourist development, and there's clearly no capacity of returning that into the private rental market. And I just want to change tack a little bit, because I don't know if you know it, Ellie, but I know a BBC podcast and program from BBC Radio 4 for all the nerds out there called More or Less, which is a statistics program, which I absolutely love, which kind of puts me down in the nerd category, I guess. And they investigate statistical claims, and they have a great time debunking Boris Johnson and various other people who use the facts sloppily. And one of their slogans is that a big number? And when we get not 25,000, but 6,000 odd entire homes listed, usually, we know that a chunk of them are holiday apartments that are not suitable for the private rental market. Those 10, for example, in Galway Bay, and also you can see they're very heavily concentrated in tourist areas. But let's say that's 6,000. When I compare that to the last census, and the CSO found 183,000 vacant homes in Ireland, of which 50,000 were in Dublin, where the housing need is most acute. That seems to me to be a gigantic difference. And again, you're going to hate me for the Dublin comparison, but that's where the housing crisis is most acute. At most, 400 potentially rented homes on Airbnb versus 50,000 vacant homes. That's just astonishing. That's less than 1% are Airbnb. And what I wonder about is the amount of political energy. We see just recently, as you mentioned, laws have been brought in. I'm not sure if they're being enforced. We see in your own city, a Green Party councillor is trying to take out an injunction against Airbnb. There's a huge amount of political energy and just social discussion going into Airbnb. And at absolute most, it is 1% of the issue of things that should be used as houses for people not being used as houses for people.
What's your point? Is your point that Airbnb shouldn't be regulated, or that there shouldn't be an attempt to make this enforcement? Because the
sure,
thing
of course,
is
yeah,
that
of course.
When you have a platform, so since I suppose, I mean, I think this is very interesting. One thing that I did in the past was I went undercover as a Deliveroo driver.
Oh, wow.
Which is really good fun, right? You can read about that in the Irish Examiner, who I was writing for at the time. And the reason I did that is because I see this Airbnb and Deliveroo, all of these things, as part of a pattern of disruptors. Yeah. So these are technological platforms that come in. They are global. They have a global footprint. And we have known since AOL and the child pornography scandal in the 1990s that there's a real problem there when it comes to how states are able to manage within their jurisdictions, are able to legally manage the activities of global, frequently completely anonymous, very hard to get any form of kind of transparency or interaction with the entities that can come in and make very large changes. You might not consider 6,000 properties over the, or less.
That's a good point. That's a good point, because if you're a homeless family, one property makes a difference.
Well, I mean, what's on Daft?
Yeah.
6,000 Airbnb properties. Can you get your producer to pull up the figure for what's on Daft today? Entire country?
This is the entire stock of Airbnb. So that would be compared to the entire stock of rental properties. But I actually agree with you, and I completely agree with you. If you're a homeless family, one home makes a difference to one homeless family. I completely agree with you. And I'm absolutely not going down the road of suggesting that Airbnb shouldn't be regulated. And I think the point that you made at the start was actually very acute. You've mentioned disruptors, and there's another term in this tech industry which is called idling capacity. And that means that when you have somebody, an empty nester, maybe the kids have moved out and they have a couple of spare bedrooms that they could let, somebody goes on holidays and they let their apartment or their house to somebody else coming on holidays. That type of thing uses up capacity which would otherwise just be wasted, but it's an entirely different thing what Airbnb have moved into, of letting entire properties. I completely agree with you on that. And even if it's one, it's significant, and I think it's enough to be worth regulating. So I'm 100% with you on that. But my point is more about the political discussion. And I just want to I'll try and give it very quickly, but I want to give 3 examples of things that have happened. Do you know what torches of freedom are? Have you heard the term?
No, I don't think I have.
Torches of freedom. The phrase was invented in the 1920s. Torches of freedom meant cigarettes. And
I am familiar with that. That was the campaign. Yeah. I remember
there was a feminist campaign in the 1920s of women marching outside and smoking to show how independent they could be. What they didn't know at the time was that this campaign was devised by a guy called Edward Bernays. Who was, I think, a nephew or something of Sigmund Freud, but he was famous for basically creating the American PR industry. And also, a century later, you can't hear a story about climate change without having some chortling talking head talking about what was the carbon footprint of whatever climate change conference, and trying to essentially smear people who are campaigning on climate change by their own personal habits. That phrase, that precise phrase, carbon footprint, was coined by the PR department in BP, British Petroleum. And you'd think that carbon footprint phrase, people who talk about it, are campaigning on climate change. But in reality, what's happening is that BP coined that phrase in order to focus blame, as it were, for climate change on private individuals and not on big corporations who are actually producing the oil and so forth that is causing the problem. But I have a much more interesting, I think, example of this, which is also touches on that. But the group was called Women of the Storm, which sounds very witchcrafty and Celtic and so forth. But this happened in about 2010. Obama was about a year in the White House. He had come into office after the debacle, George W. Bush's debacle with the Hurricane Katrina that destroyed Louisiana and lots of neighbouring areas to a significant degree. And he had promised in his election, in response to this, to address decades of environmental degradation and multiple economic disasters that had ruined the Gulf Coast in the United States, so the southern coast between Florida and Mexico, essentially. And then there came out a campaign, and it was promoted by a very well-produced video featuring a whole host of stars: Sandra Bullock, Blake Lively, Lenny Kravitz, John Goodman, a whole bunch of people, and also Democratic political consultant James Carville. And the Women of the Storm described themselves as a non-partisan grassroots organisation formed in New Orleans and South Louisiana in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, planning to launch a campaign to restore the Gulf. And in this video, Sandra Bullock looks at the camera and says, "The Gulf Coast is an American treasure and its deterioration affects us all. The solution begins with each American demanding the restoration of the Gulf of Mexico, its coastlines and its wetlands for ourselves and our future generations." And this led to a petition for people to sign, which hundreds of thousands of people signed. And the petition was very simply worded. It just said, "I demand that a plan to restore America's Gulf be fully funded and implemented for me and future generations." And this was obviously targeted at pressuring Obama to keep his election promise. The thing about that campaign was that it was managed and run and funded and conceived from start to finish by BP, the oil company, which had spilled a gigantic amount of oil, which caused a huge amount of damage on the Gulf Coast. And if you listened carefully to what they were saying, what Sandra Bullock was saying was that they wanted the US government, the US taxpayer, to be on the hook to do the whole cleanup rather than BP having to do it. And what they were trying to do was create political pressure that would divert away from themselves. And those are a few examples of, I think, I mean, you can call it devious, but you can't deny that it's very clever marketing whereby companies manage to harness the power of people who you would normally expect to oppose them. So all of those stars, Sandra Bullock, in fact, pulled her approval of that and publicly denounced that and said that she'd been tricked into helping them make that promotional video. And my point is that we have to kind of be clever here. And in Ireland, almost uniquely in the OECD, we have basically no property taxes. And that means that all of our taxes are focused on income and transactions, which means that you pay your tax as income tax rather than paying it as property tax. But that also means that people whose wealth is mostly or completely comes from property pay basically no tax. And ordinary working stiffs pay much more tax to make up for that. And that's a pretty sweet deal for the rich, whose wealth is mostly tied up in property. And whenever you get an election campaign and people say, and it's a hard thing to say, if you're running for election, I'll introduce a new tax, you will straight away get people, including people before Profit Party and Fiona Ryan, notably, saying that, you know, no property tax, no tax on my house. I've already earned my money and paid income tax on it. I shouldn't have to pay any tax. I think that suits the rich far more than they realize. And the one thing, and I know that I've pointed you to the link, I came across, because I tweeted about this, and I came across an account on Twitter. And the account is called Ban Short-Term Let, so it's a pretty clear indication of what their interest is. And when you go to tweet stats, you can have a look at how often this account is tweeting. And there's also another website, Account Analysis, which will look at how this account is performing. This account was established 2 years ago. So it's been sitting there for 2 years, but it didn't start tweeting until a week ago. And in the past week, this account has tweeted thousands of times. It is tweeting hundreds and hundreds of tweets a day, 600 or 700 tweets a day in some cases. And if you look at the analysis, they're tweeting right throughout the day, typically from about 9 a.m. until 1 a.m. In some hours, they're tweeting more than 100 times. I can see some hours here, 169 tweets in 1 hour, 126 tweets in another hour. And also one thing that Account Analysis, or the tweet stats, does very handily is it tells you what mode, what device they are tweeting with. And supposedly this account is tweeting 100% with Twitter for Android. So it looks like it's tweeting from an Android phone. But there's two things to know about that. Number one, that can be spoofed, and you can actually see it cleverly. Sometimes people can have on their tweets like sent from my toaster or whatever. It's kind of a bit of a joke. So you can spoof that quite easily. But this Twitter account allegedly has, from an Android phone in the past week, sent 3,000 tweets. And if you just consider the practicality of that, and as I said, I can see 1 hour there just recently, yesterday, they tweeted 170 times in an hour. That's one tweet every 20 seconds. I'm going to let you say something, Ellie. I presume you agree that typing 180 tweets an hour once every 20 seconds without a break on an Android phone, that's simply not true. That's just not happening, is it?
Well, it sounds automated, to be sure.
Yeah.
I'm interested to find out where you're going with this, because you've constructed an enormous story, and I'm like, wow, this is taking us through over a century of stuff, right?
Yes,
well, through to the thing. So
I've never had a guest so
this?
Appreciative of my research. If you look at the tweets, unsurprisingly, these are 100% obsessed with banning short-term lets, and almost. I mean,
presumably this is an automated account, right?
You would think so. I mean, I don't know anything other than, I want to be very careful from a libel point of view, saying I don't have any information other than what's in the public domain or what I've seen on these websites. But you can see that they are enormously, at just a gigantic rate, whenever anybody mentions anything to do with the housing crisis, this account will then automatically tweet at them a picture and a screen grab of that inside Airbnb website and the screenshot is clipped in a particular way, which purports to show that there are 25,000 properties on Airbnb that could potentially be rented out. So, as I said there, the handle on that is ban short-term let. Now, those handles can be changed, and I think it's very notable that the account was created 2 years ago, but they didn't tweet at all until a week ago, and have tweeted 3,000 times in a week. And what I think you and I would agree there is that that is a very sophisticated operation that is automatically tweeting at anybody who talks about the housing crisis. So anybody who mentions the housing crisis in Ireland will immediately get a tweet from this account mentioning Airbnb and purporting to show that the core problem here is Airbnb. We can't know for certain, but I think any reasonable person would conclude that somebody is spending money on this. This doesn't come for free. Somebody is spending money to interrupt every conversation about the housing crisis with information about Airbnb and to essentially give the blame to Airbnb. That's what appears to be happening there, doesn't it?
I don't know, I'm just looking through the tweets and replies on that account, and a lot of them seem to be targeted at one particular Green Party councillor whose stuff is not short-term letting at all. It's retweeting stuff from the Irish Inquiry. I mean, it would be possible to just go into TweetDeck. I mean, it would be a substantial amount of your time, but you could go into TweetDeck and just set a load of, like, all of the tweets that are going out that seem to be worded very similarly. A lot of them are probably copy-paste text in snippets and stuff like that. I've no idea. I can't tell.
Yeah, clearly,
myself.
My point here is that it seems improbable, and I've been watching this, and this is being tweeted basically anytime people are awake in Ireland, from about 8 a.m. until 1 a.m. every day, very, very intensely. I want to be careful from a defamation point of view. You're correct that if you go through a few, you will get a bunch targeted at this person or this politician or whatever. Just be wary of the fact that there's 3,000 tweets here in a week already. So you can come across a batch that are aimed at one person, but I've gone through these in perhaps more detail. I've had a bit of time to look at it. And I know it happens that if you do mention anything about the housing crisis, you get this account tweeting at you. I know that happened because it happened to me as well. And I should say, by the way, there's absolutely no information about the identity of who's running this account. So there is no banner picture. The profile picture is a picture which perhaps might be inspired slightly by your work. And what it is a map of Ireland with two figures over each county comparing
I think that's
the
the map
Airbnb
that went out with
and
the
the Daft
recently, isn't it?
number.
The Times did a really,
It could well be, yeah. The handle is ban short-term let. It's quite easy to change those, and that doesn't leave, you can't go and search what they used to be called. The name on it is The Biker. And as I said, that account existed without tweeting at all for 2 years and then has started this massive burst of activity. And I compare this to an article I'm seeing here by Owen Burke-Jones, who I think would not have a reputation as being the most left-wing Irish Times commentator. And his article, I'm just looking at last November, he's saying, a vacant property tax sounds good, but it won't make any difference. That's the headline on his article. We had a vacant property tax. It was set up in such a way that less than 1% of the tax due was collected. It was then scrapped in favour of a promise to bring in a new one. The promise to bring in the new vacant property tax was in the last budget. It won't come in the next budget, but we are promised that it will come in the budget after that. That comes at the end of 2023 if the current government is in office. What I'm suggesting, Ellie, is that I think that people perhaps like Councillor Fiona Ryan and some others might be being taken for a fool. Well, by some people who are running a campaign that don't choose to make themselves public. And clearly, I think this account is about as clear evidence as you could get that there is somebody running a campaign outside the public eye, but trying to influence public opinion. This is an influence campaign. And wherever the issue of property tax and vacancy tax comes up, the conversation gets drowned out by Airbnb. Now, as I said to you, I don't think Airbnb is irrelevant, but I think it's so much smaller than the other issue that it is remarkable that the concentration of the conversation is so much on Airbnb, which is perhaps 1% of the issue, and so little on vacancy. And we know, as it was reported in the Journal, I'll put the link in here, in Dublin, we have 13 vacant properties for every homeless man, woman and child. And I'm wondering is this a Torches of Freedom type campaign being run?
By Airbnb? because I just want to point out out to you that
the reverse.
It was the corporate entities that were running those very successful campaigns. Yeah. Okay. So so if you're saying that an actor in the market, in the short-term letting market, is behind that would make some kind of sense. But if you're talking about some kind of just broad-scale political disruption, I mean, we can see that stuff's happening all the time, right? You remember Stephen Donnelly and the stupid tweets there recently? Twitter?
No. What I'm suggesting,
like, it's completely seeded with crap, right?
Sure. But what I'm suggesting, who benefits from this, if this campaign is successful in its apparent aim, is people who hold large amounts of property in Ireland effectively tax-free. And I know personally of this, and I can point to personal examples, there are a whole series of properties, I know in Dublin city centre, and I'm sure in Cork and other places as well, that were bought up for next to nothing in the 80s, that are worth many millions now. Huge proportion of them are vacant because that property doesn't exist to serve society, to be a home or whatever. That property is essentially a bank. It is a bank account, and people store wealth as that. And many hundreds of millions, in fact certainly many billions, are being stored by very rich people just by buying chunks of the city and leaving them vacant. And clearly a property tax would threaten that very seriously. That would essentially make that happen. By the way, that behaviour is an absolute cancer on Irish society and the built environment. And I'll give one example, which is South William Street in Dublin. South William Street is about 100 metres from Grafton Street, which is one of the most expensive properties in the world, like a shopping street. 100 metres away, you have South William Street, and if you walk down that street at 4 o'clock on a November evening, you can see that most of the upper floors are vacant. And I happen to be aware of the fact that the owners, of a couple of owners in particular that I have in mind, bought up those properties for nearly nothing. They don't need to rent them out because the capital appreciation dwarfs the potential rental income. They are using those properties as a bank. If those properties were taxed, it would make that impossible if they did nothing with that property over decades, as has happened over years and decades. That would take away the full value of that property. But they are rich, influential people. And I've no doubt that in the event that they wish to, they could throw a few 100,000 at a campaign to prevent property tax becoming the focus of the homelessness and the housing crisis debate, which it really is, because there is just no penalty for keeping a property empty in this country. And people think, oh, but they could get rent. They might get rent. They could, but these people are so wealthy and property price appreciation has been so fast that rent is just a detail on that. The purpose of those properties is to hold and store wealth. And it is remarkable, I think, that you get people before profit, in particular, campaigning against a property tax. The only wealth tax that really has any likelihood of yielding any money, because shares and whatever can run away to the Caymans. You can't take the property out to a tax haven. But it might be noticeable that their leading TD, Richard Boyd Barrett, represents Dún Laoghaire, where there's a huge amount of property wealth. And I don't accuse them of being bad actors, by the way. I think they're perhaps just not thinking things through as carefully as they should. But I've seen this, and I was just really shocked by the degree to which you can't say anything in Ireland about the housing crisis, be it on Twitter or elsewhere, without having the conversation being shouted down by Airbnb. And I'm not suggesting it's not a good idea to debate Airbnb, the regulation and so forth, and as you brought up, the contrast between, the original intention of using the idling capacity, a bedroom when it's spare or a house when someone's on holidays, and it turning into a business. And by the way, I should say in your favour, one of the things I saw, and I'm not going to give the names, but I saw two men's names as one of the top hosts in Dublin. I couldn't verify this 100%, but it did look like they owned 11 houses.
In Kinsale, Tim Lombard told me,
to the rental market.
Tim Lombard. I'm completely apolitical, by the way. I'm not interested in politics at all. I'm interested in just facts and verifying what I see happening around me. And so Fine Gael councillor Tim Lombard, who I spoke to for this article as well, he told me of somebody. Kinsale obviously would be a kind of a tourist hotspot where there's been a problem for a great number of years with young locals being being unable to being priced out of their own locality essentially and having to move away. And he told me about one owner who has 8 properties who ended up setting up their own property management company just in order to facilitate those, and that those properties are sitting vacant for very long periods of time. So they're taken down. So it's only worth his while to pay for somebody to go in and be there and to service all of those properties over the summer, and then they're taken down and the properties stay vacant for the remainder of the year. So he says they're vacant for 6 months of the year, those properties. So that becomes a vacancy issue as well.
Mm-hmm. And I don't want to undermine your research and that issue. And it is a live issue. And as I said, if I was able to find one instance, it is probably the top instance of some 2 guys who own apparently 11 bona fide houses, not something built as a tourist development, that they can basically Airbnb throughout the year. I'm sure they're making a stack of money, but I'm not sure that's the best use of those houses. And I would be very curious as to whether those houses have planning permission for being used as tourist destinations rather than private homes. So I'm not diminishing the relevance of it, but it's the proportionality here. If you try to make any comparison of the amount of political energy or the amount of just discussion on vacancy and 183 vacant properties in the country compared to, at the top end, maybe 6,000 or 7,000 properties being used as Airbnbs when they shouldn't be. I think 183 versus 6,000, or in Dublin, 400 versus 50,000. Are you sure that the political energy and attention is going in the right direction?
I definitely wouldn't see it as an either or. I think that sometimes when you see something that is a glaringly obvious problem, I wouldn't compare like with those two. You're talking about two separate
But it's something that could be a house that isn't. You know, it could be a home that
and
isn't.
Similarly, a lot of those 180,000 properties that you're talking about there, I mean, I see those ghost estates in the most ridiculous places with no services, and they're all added on
but
to
50,000 in Dublin.
But there isn't
a square metre of Dublin that somebody wouldn't live in, and 50,000 empty houses in Dublin.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I'm saying is that I think you're conflating two things that are two separate issues with two separate fixes. And I think that the thing that attracts me to the Airbnb story is that it is a relatively simple one. It is a relatively simple thing to see. It is a pattern. It's a pattern that we've seen in other countries. Yeah. It is more profitable. The top earning Cork Airbnb 5-bedroom house that I found, that I cross-referenced between AirDNA and her own ad on Airbnb, is pulling in 71 grand a year on Airbnb.
And there's no way you could get the 71 grand in rent or anything like it for that.
She's doubling what she's able to earn. At the same time, may I point out that there were no change of use planning applications granted for Cork City. Cork City has not granted any. So that is a clear indication where that individual has not applied for is not operating within the law and is pulling in 71,000 euros per year. And Cork City Council is not doesn't have the resourcing capacity to do the enforcement that the platform should be doing themselves. So I'm not particularly, I know that this is a political podcast, but I'm not particularly interested in, comparing these two different issues. I think when it comes to vacancy, I'm very interested in that issue, and we have covered on Tripe and Rasheen things to do with dereliction rates, vacancy rates, largely more embedded in the local authorities' response to those issues. But what I see there is a huge thing to unpack, because you're dealing with Irish people's extremely damaged and fractured past record with property, right? Like this country, think about the population in decline, not from the end of the famine, but until the 1960s, the Irish population in decline. The country was basically abandoned. When somebody died, you pulled out the door, you locked it, and the roof caved in and you never went back. And that's a part of almost more of a kind of a psychological problem that Irish people have with land, with our connection to our land, with how we value it, with how we want to take pride in properties and do them up instead of let them collapse. There's huge, massive myriad issues there. I don't conflate the two issues. I don't think it's an either or. And I think that actually by in what you're doing, you're actually inadvertently doing the same thing that you're worried about happening. You're deflecting attention from the Airbnb problem, which is a problem. It's not as big a problem as, can I finish? It's not as big a problem as the clearly politicized actors in this conversation, people like People Before Profit and people like that, will always go for the grabby figure wherever they can. And they're not data analysts and they're not going to look into it over much. But in that, whether it be 25,000, which it clearly isn't, or 6,000 or under 6,000, we do have something happening here. And what I'm interested is the legal structures around that. Can that be enforced? And what the onus is on the enormous, anonymous, global entity that pulls in 5.9 billion in profit per year and advertises properties on their website that are not in line with local laws. That's what I'm interested in. I think it's a different story, and I think that by deflecting it and starting to talk about vacant homes, you're actually going away from being able to discuss this issue.
Can I reply to that, Ellie? That first of all, you don't have any disagreement from me in terms of the enormous corporations doing this disruption over which there is no democratic control, and I completely agree with you on that they're essentially managing to evade that, and you can say even in very simple ways, like you mentioned about the change of use applications. But our national discourse is an issue as well. It's not one that trumps it. And I'm just wondering, would you comment on the relative attention given to those issues given their relative sizes?
No, because I think one is an easy fix and one is a difficult fix. Because in my conversations with people working in housing and local authorities, it's always very, very fascinating to me that there is this real fear of disrupting people's property rights, and I can see the validity in that. So whatever the fix is for all of those things, so we've had levies on vacant properties, we've had levies on derelict properties. Yeah,
they don't work because it's very difficult to do it. But what we need, and it's not a popular thing to say, but it is true. What we need in this country is to shift our tax base away from income and onto property, so that everybody should pay property tax. That's not meant to say people should pay more tax or less tax. That should be something that is revenue neutral. But that Ireland, which is completely unique in the OECD in having the tax base entirely focused on income and transactions, means that some very, very wealthy people stay very wealthy without ever having to pay a cent in tax, and they drive their cars on the roads, they send their children to school and don't pay any tax to contribute to the social cost of those. Okay,
but I also
it is that conversation that I feel is being disrupted by people like People Before Profit, who, whenever you mention property tax, they say, no more taxes, no tax on my house, shouting a slogan. And anyway, if you want to solve the housing problem, just fix Airbnb. And I think that if we had a property tax like every other rational developed country, then the opportunity to use vacant buildings as a bank would disappear, and those buildings would be forced back into use. And we would not have the housing crisis that we have.
Are you talking about a property tax on people's primary residence?
I think it is indistinguishable legally. It's not possible to distinguish that legally. But in particular, what I'm saying is that someone who works a job and lives in a house should not be paying any more or less tax. You would say a typical person who pays, let's say, 10 grand in income tax every year should perhaps find themselves paying 6 grand in income tax and 4 grand in property taxes. But somebody who owns 20 or 50 houses would then be paying property tax on each of those. And would be required to make a contribution to society that they're not making, and would be powerfully disincentivized from leaving those properties vacant and doing a dog in a manger because they're just using those properties essentially as a bank. It is essentially a mini version of what Russian oligarchs are doing in Mayfair in London. They're getting their money out and they buy up stuff, not because they want to use it, but because they want a store of wealth that doesn't go away. So yes, there has to be a property tax on everything. If you don't do that, you can't do it at all, as has been discovered by the difficulties of defining a vacant property.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge amount there. I mean, I think clearly the people who have a very vast amount of property are the people who are able to afford to pay clever accountants who have various different other tricks up their sleeve, have multiple registered companies and all types of things. And I wonder how you could make sure that you were enforcing something there that genuinely benefited people who had one home or maybe...
Oh, I'll tell you.
Or maybe one home plus an investment property, because, there are people out there who have gone like, well, we're getting on a little bit and this is our thing. And, while I'm not towing the line there with the kind of Fine Gael kind of mom and pop landlord thing, that's obviously clearly at this stage a little bit of a kind of a fantasy or whatever. It does, to a certain degree, there is a small middle tier of people who maybe are of what, if you were English, we would call the middle class, who are quite likely to be squeezed the most by this kind of thing. Whereas it's the multinationals, I mean, that are going to get away with it. And interestingly enough, Airbnb is headquartered in Dublin and benefits from our corporate tax rate.
Yeah. So, but pause for a second on that. The way to make sure they can't do that is you tax everything without exception. If you start introducing these things, if it's your home, you don't do it. And if it meets this criteria or that criteria, you don't tax it. That's what allows the clever lawyers in to start redefining things and getting people who shouldn't avoid the tax able to avoid it. But consider that those people who have clever lawyers and clever accountants also have clever PR people. And I strongly suspect that the reason that Fine Gael present that line that you mentioned of the mom and pop who just bought a second home because they needed it as an investment, they didn't have a proper pension, yada yada, or who perhaps run strange Twitter accounts that seem to be partly automated. The people who have clever lawyers and clever accountants probably have clever PR people working for them as well, and I suspect that that's what's happening.
Well, I'm not actually prepared for a conversation about a vacant property tax because I was invited on to talk about Airbnb.
I understand. That is a diversion, but that should have been a one-line diversion. We've gone down a bit of a rabbit hole there, but, and you're correct. I wanted to just mention that in passing. We got a bit deep into it. I shouldn't ask you deeply about things that we didn't discuss beforehand. But my point is that, and I think you will agree with this one, we have to be careful about bad actors appearing to enter the conversation on one side and perhaps benefiting people who are preferring to stay in the shadows.
Yeah, that's true across the board. That's why it's much better to stay off Twitter and go to the actual real world for your information, isn't it? We have a real problem. We have a more fundamental problem here with people believing that they're involved in some form of empiricism where they're looking at a screen. I mean, go and talk to the people who work in your local authority if you want to find out how things are run. So that's where I suppose that I founded Tripe and Drisheen, because I'm kind of sick of a disconnected narrative, and I want to do local reporting now, because what I want to do is I want to go, okay, like I lecture in media, I tell my students, please bring me a news story about a squirrel up a tree and not, in your local area, and not Donald Trump, because you can't interview Donald Trump, but you can see the squirrel in the tree. I think we're so far from any form of reality now on social media, and Twitter is the worst possible example. The bots are everywhere, flocking around. My first response to that Stephen Donnelly thing was to send in freedom of information requests, because I think I have a pretty good idea of what actually happened.
Ellie O'Byrne, co-editor of Cork's local news Substack, Tripe and Drisheen, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thanks very much, William. It was a pleasure.
If you like the Here's How podcast, please rate and review the show on iTunes and other podcast providers. Share it on Facebook and Twitter, but most of all, tell your friends.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Cork's local news Substack, Tripe and Drisheen, at @Drisheen, and there's a link there to Ellie's Twitter as well. And you can get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or a topic for the next show. Thanks again also to all of the patrons on Patreon. As I said, we don't get any huge amount of money like some Irish podcasters that I can think of do, but it pays for things like web hosting, and Kevin and I basically donate our time for free. But if you could do the same as the current patrons and donate the cover price of an Irish Times once or twice a month, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The assistant producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.